At 20 years old, Lyora Simmons had exactly $124 to her name and a rusted 2004 Honda Civic for a bedroom. She didn't buy a lottery ticket. She bought a weed-choked, forgotten slice of dirt at a county tax auction. What was buried exactly 6 feet underneath it would start a war. November in Mercer County, Ohio, didn't just get cold. It got cruel. The chill seeped through the floorboards of Lyora's Honda Civic like ice water, settling into her bones. She was 20 years old, 2 years aged out of a fractured foster care system, and entirely invisible. When the engine of her car finally died outside a closed strip mall, taking the heater with it, Lyora knew she was out of options. The homeless shelters were overflowing, and sleeping in the car with temperatures dropping to 9 degrees was a death sentence. Every day, Lyora survived by retreating to the county library, hiding in the back corners under the guise of reading thick reference books. The head librarian, a stern but quietly observant woman named Mrs. Gable, never kicked her out. Instead, she occasionally left half a sandwich or a thermos of hot tea near Lyora's desk, pretending she had brought too much from home. It was in this quiet sanctuary, desperately searching the county's public access computers for any lifeline, that Lyora stumbled across a digital graveyard. The county tax defaulted property list. The county was auctioning off seized lands, properties where owners had died or abandoned them, leaving years of unpaid taxes. Most of the lots were going for thousands of dollars, far beyond Lyora's pathetic savings. But then, buried on page 14 of the municipal registry, was parcel 402B on Sycamore Lane. It wasn't even a proper lot. It was a bizarre, triangular sliver of land, measuring just 0.12 acres, wedged between a sprawling, abandoned textile factory and a chain-link fence bordering a commercial trucking route. The city had zoned it as unbuildable waste space. The owed back taxes? $89.50. Lyora stared at the screen, her heart hammering against her ribs. If she owned land, even a useless strip of toxic dirt, she wouldn't be trespassing. She could pitch a heavy-duty winter tent. She would have a legal address. She would have a right to exist somewhere. The next morning, Lyora walked into the Mercer County Courthouse. Her clothes were layered and worn, her boots held together by duct tape, but her jaw was set. The municipal clerk, Brenda Hilliard-Stoll, a woman with tight lips and a gaze that practically radiated judgment, looked at Lyora as if she had tracked mud onto a pristine carpet. "I'm here for the over-the-counter tax deeds," Lyora said, her voice shaking only slightly. "Parcel 402B, Brenda scoffed, flipping lazily through a massive binder. "That lot is a garbage dump, sweetheart. It's an easement mistake from the 1950s. You can't build on it. You can't run water to it. The city only listed it to clear the books." "I have the $89.50, Lyora replied, sliding a crumpled pile of $10 bills, fives, and a heavy handful of quarters onto the marble counter. Add the filing fees, and it took her down to a flat zero. Brenda sneered, but processed the paperwork. 30 minutes later, Lyora walked out into the freezing wind, clutching a piece of paper that changed her status from a vagrant to a property owner. She had a quitclaim deed in her name. When Lyora arrived at her new kingdom, the reality was sobering. Parcel 402B was a nightmare of shattered glass, dead, waist-high weeds, and illegal dumping. Someone had left a rotting mattress and 3 blown-out truck tires on her property. But as she stood in the center of the triangle, she felt a bizarre, overwhelming sense of pride. It was hers. Using the very last of her cash, which she earned from a day labor shift, sweeping floors at a local hardware store, Liora bought a heavy-duty canvas tent, a Sub-Zero sleeping bag, and a small propane heater. She spent 3 agonizing days clearing the debris by hand, her knuckles bleeding and blistering in the cold, until she had a flat, clean patch of dirt in the center of the weeds. For the first 2 weeks, it worked. She had a sanctuary. But the world doesn't like it when the invisible suddenly stake a claim. The harassment started on a Tuesday. A Mercer County Sheriff's cruiser rolled up to the curb, its lights flashing against the canvas of her tent. 2 deputies approached, hands resting casually on their belts. They told her she was loitering, trespassing on city property, and that she had 10 minutes to pack up her garbage before they arrested her for vagrancy. Liora didn't cry. She didn't beg. She unzipped her tent, reached into her backpack, and pulled out a plastic sheet protector. Inside was the stamped, notarized deed. "I own this land," Liora said, her voice steady, echoing in the cold night air. "Parcel 402B. You are currently standing on private property." The deputies were stunned. They ran her name, ran the parcel number, and eventually had to walk back to their cruiser, muttering under their breath. But the victory was short-lived. The police visit had drawn the attention of the neighborhood's undisputed heavyweight, Owen Calloway. Calloway was a predatory local developer who had been quietly buying up the surrounding industrial blocks for pennies on the dollar. He had plans to bulldoze the entire sector and build a massive, lucrative logistics warehouse for an e-commerce giant. He owned the abandoned factory to Liora's left. He owned the trucking lot to her right. And now, right in the center of his multi-million-dollar footprint, sat a 20-year-old girl in a canvas tent. Calloway didn't send lawyers first. He sent intimidation. Heavy machinery would inexplicably park right on the edge of her property line, idling their massive diesel engines for hours while she tried to sleep. Floodlights from the adjacent factory were angled directly at her tent, turning her nights into blinding, sleepless interrogations. One afternoon, a sleek black SUV pulled up to the curb. Owen Calloway rolled down the window. He was in his 50s, impeccably dressed, with a smile that never quite reached his cold, calculating eyes. "You're a stubborn kid, I'll give you that," Calloway called out, resting his arm on the door. "I need this strip to connect my loading bays. I'll give you $500 right now to sign the deed over. You can go get yourself a warm motel room." Liora stood by the flap of her tent. "The lot isn't for sale." Calloway's smile vanished. "Listen to me, little girl. You're living in the dirt. Winter is going to bury you. I can make your life a living hell with zoning infractions alone. Take the money, or I'll have the city condemn this strip as a biological hazard by Friday." He rolled up his window and sped off, leaving Liora shivering in the exhaust fumes. She was terrified. She knew he wasn't bluffing. Brenda Hilliard, at the clerk's office, was known to be in Calloway's pocket. They could easily draft a bogus ordinance to evict her. Liora had until Friday to figure out how to fight a millionaire. But Mother Nature intervened first. That Thursday night, the worst torrential rainstorm Mercer County had seen in a decade slammed into the valley. The rain fell in aggressive horizontal sheets, turning the dead earth of Parcel 402B into a treacherous sea of thick, sucking mud. Liora sat huddled in her tent, clutching her sleeping bag as the canvas whipped and howled against the wind. Around 3 a.m., the ground beneath her began to vibrate. It wasn't the rumble of a passing truck. It was a deep, structural groan from the earth itself. Suddenly, the back corner of her tent violently dipped. Leora scrambled backward just in time. The earth wasn't just muddy, it was collapsing. A massive sinkhole was opening up on the northern edge of her triangular lot, swallowing the dead weeds, the topsoil, and the back stakes of her tent. Panic seized her. She grabbed her flashlight, threw on her heavy coat, and crawled out into the freezing downpour. The rain lashed at her face as she shined the beam into the newly formed crater. She expected to see a broken city water main or a collapsed sewage pipe. Instead, the beam of her flashlight struck solid, rusted iron. Leora wiped the rain and mud from her eyes, leaning dangerously close to the edge of the pit. The runoff water was washing the mud away, revealing something distinctly man-made. It was a massive, flat concrete slab bordered by thick steel, and dead center in the slab was a heavy, circular iron wheel, like the hatch of a submarine. Her heart stopped. This wasn't a pipe. This was a bunker. Ignoring the freezing rain, Leora slid down into the mud-filled sinkhole. The cold was agonizing, biting through her jeans and soaking her boots, but the adrenaline rushing through her veins masked the pain. She dropped to her knees, using her bare hands to claw away the remaining sludge covering the hatch. Engraved in the center of the iron wheel were faded, ornate letters. A.P. 1924. Arthur Pendleton. Leora remembered reading about him in one of Mrs. Gable's local history books at the library. Pendleton was a notorious bootlegger and local magnate during Prohibition. He supposedly controlled the liquor flow from Canada down through Ohio, hoarding millions in untraceable assets before he mysteriously vanished in 1929. The historians claimed his empire was dismantled. None of them mentioned he owned a sliver of land on Sycamore Lane. Leora grabbed the iron wheel. It was rusted solid. She planted her boots against the concrete, gripped the wet metal, and pulled with every ounce of strength her malnourished body possessed. Nothing. She screamed in frustration, the sound swallowed by the thunder overhead. She grabbed a heavy rock from the mud and began hammering at the rusted hinges, striking the metal until her hands bled. She gripped the wheel again. Crack! The rust seal broke. The wheel groaned, turning a quarter inch, then a half inch. Leora spun it, throwing her entire body weight against it until the locking mechanism gave way with a heavy, metallic clank. She grabbed the handle and hauled the heavy door upward. A rush of stale, bone-dry air escaped from the darkness below. A smell of old paper, oiled leather, and something sweet, like fermented oak. Shining her flashlight down, she saw a rusted steel ladder descending into a cavernous black space. Water from the storm was starting to pour over the lip of the hatch. If she didn't act now, whatever was down there would be destroyed by the flood. Leora climbed down. The ladder dropped about 15 feet. When her boots hit the floor, it wasn't dirt. It was polished, dry concrete. She swept her flashlight across the room, and the breath caught in her throat. The underground vault was roughly the size of a 2-car garage. The walls were lined with heavy wooden racks, miraculously preserved by the airtight seal. Stacked floor to ceiling on the racks were hundreds of wooden crates. Leora walked slowly to the nearest crate. She found a rusted crowbar resting on a nearby table and pried the top off the wood. Inside, nestled in decaying straw, were perfectly intact glass bottles. The labels were pristine, shielded from light and moisture for a century. Macallan Single Malt, distilled 1919. There were hundreds of them. A collection of pre-Prohibition whiskey so rare that a single bottle could fetch tens of thousands of dollars at auction. But that wasn't all. At the back of the room, Sitting on an oak desk was a heavy steel safe. It was already cracked open, its heavy door resting ajar. Leora approached it, her hands trembling. Inside the safe were stacks of oilcloth bundles. She carefully unwrapped one. Gold, heavy, solid, stamped bullion bars, alongside velvet pouches filled with Art Deco diamond jewelry, brooches, rings, and heavy emerald necklaces that caught the beam of her flashlight and threw scattered prisms across the dark room. Leora Simmons, a 20-year-old girl who had been sleeping in a freezing car 3 weeks ago, was standing in the middle of a multi-million-dollar treasure trove. But the victory was instantly shattered. From above, cutting through the sound of the rain, came the distinct, heavy thud of footsteps in the mud near the lip of the sinkhole. "Well, well, well," a voice echoed down into the vault. Leora froze, her blood turning to ice. She slowly aimed her flashlight up toward the open hatch. Standing at the top, peering down into the abyss with a predatory grin illuminated by a heavy-duty spotlight, was Owen Calloway. "I wondered why my ground-penetrating radar showed an anomaly on this worthless strip of dirt," Calloway shouted down, the rain slicking his hair. "I think you and I need to renegotiate our real estate deal, Leora, and you're not going to like the new terms." The heavy-duty spotlight glared down through the pouring rain, blinding Leora as she stared up at the opening of the sinkhole. Owen Calloway's silhouette loomed over the rusted iron hatch like a gargoyle. "I've got an excavator parked on the perimeter, Leora," Calloway yelled over the thunder, his voice dripping with venomous glee. "In about 5 minutes, my crew is going to push 3 tons of wet earth right back over that hole. No one knows you're down there. No one cares. Toss up your signed quitclaim deed and pass up whatever you found in that vault. You do that, I drop a rope. You don't, and this becomes your tomb." Leora backed away from the ladder, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She was freezing, drenched in freezing rain and mud. But a sudden, blinding clarity cut through her panic. Calloway was a predator. If she surrendered the deed and the treasure, he wouldn't pull her up. He would bury the hole anyway, to silence the only witness to his theft. "Go to hell, Calloway!" Leora screamed into the dark, her voice echoing off the concrete walls of the vault. "Suit yourself," Calloway sneered. Clang. The heavy iron hatch slammed shut, cutting off the spotlight and plunging the vault into absolute, suffocating blackness. A second later, she heard the rusted locking wheel scrape into place, followed by the terrifying, heavy thud of mud and rocks hitting the top of the iron door. He was actually burying her alive. Panic clawed at her throat. Leora scrambled in the pitch black, her shivering hands desperately patting the wet floor until her fingers brushed the cold metal of her flashlight. She clicked it on. The narrow beam cut through the dust motes, illuminating her cage. She had limited oxygen, and the walls were solid, 1920s poured concrete. But as she forced herself to breathe, she remembered the history book Mrs. Gable had given her. Arthur Pendleton wasn't just a bootlegger. He was a master smuggler. He moved thousands of gallons of illicit Canadian whiskey under the noses of federal agents. A man like that wouldn't build a vault with only one way in. He would never back himself into a corner. Leora grabbed the heavy, rusted crowbar she had used to open the crates. She rushed to the back wall of the vault, moving her flashlight beam over the heavy wooden racks. Nothing but concrete and rotting timber. She moved to the right wall. Solid. She moved to the left, behind the massive iron safe. There, near the floor, the texture of the wall changed. It wasn't poured concrete. It was cinder block, hastily mortared. Adrenaline surged through her veins. Liora swung the crowbar with everything she had left, smashing the heavy iron head into the center of the block. The impact sent a painful shockwave up her arms, but the old brittle mortar cracked. She struck it again, screaming with the effort. A chunk of cinder block crumbled, revealing a gaping black hole. She battered the wall until the hole was wide enough to crawl through, ignoring the sharp edges that tore through her jacket and scraped her shoulders. Squeezing through the breach, she tumbled headfirst into a narrow, earthen tunnel reinforced with rotting wooden beams. It smelled of decay and wet clay, but more importantly, she felt a faint, freezing draft of fresh air moving across her face. Before crawling forward, she reached back into the vault. She couldn't carry the crates of whiskey, nor the heavy gold bars. They would weigh her down in the mud. Instead, she grabbed 3 of the heavy velvet pouches from the open safe and shoved them deep into her inner coat pockets. Liora crawled for what felt like miles. The tunnel sloped sharply upward, the rotting support beams groaning under the weight of the waterlogged earth above. Her knees were bruised, her hands bleeding, but the draft was growing stronger. Finally, her flashlight beam hit a dead end, a heavy wooden trapdoor above her head. She braced her boots against the tunnel walls, pushed her back against the wood, and heaved. The trapdoor gave way with a splintering crack. Liora rolled out onto a hard, dusty wooden floor, gasping for air. She swung her flashlight around. She was standing inside a cavernous, dilapidated warehouse filled with abandoned rusting machinery and broken windows. She recognized the massive rusted looms immediately. She was inside the abandoned textile factory. She had just crawled completely off her tiny triangle of land and directly onto Owen Calloway's property. Through the broken windows, she could see the flashing yellow lights of Calloway's excavator. He was 50 yards away, standing in the pouring rain in his designer coat, directing a machine operator to push mounds of mud over her campsite, burying the hatch entirely. Liora didn't hesitate. Slipping through the shadows of the factory, she found a rusted side door, kicked it open, and fled into the freezing, rain-swept night. Her Honda Civic was dead on the street, so she ran. She ran 3 miles through the industrial district, clutching the velvet pouches to her chest, driven entirely by rage and the primal need to survive. At 5:15 a.m., Martha Gable, the head librarian of Mercer County, woke to a frantic pounding on her front door. When she opened it, she found Liora Simmons, collapsed on her porch, covered in mud, blood, and shivering violently. Martha didn't ask questions. She pulled the girl inside, wrapped her in thick, heated blankets, and made a pot of scalding coffee. Once Liora had stopped shaking enough to speak, she emptied her pockets onto Martha's quaint floral kitchen table. Heavy emerald brooches, flawless Art Deco diamond rings, and fist-sized rubies spilled across the linoleum, sparkling wildly under the fluorescent kitchen light. Martha stared at the impossible fortune, then looked at the bruised, defiant 20-year-old girl sitting at her table. "Calloway tried to bury me alive for this," Liora whispered, her voice hoarse. "And tomorrow, he's going to dig it all up, thinking I'm dead at the bottom of that vault." Martha Gable's stern, matronly face hardened into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. "No," the librarian said softly. "He isn't. My brother-in-law is a federal property attorney in Columbus. He eats arrogant men like Owen Calloway for breakfast. You get some sleep, Liora. I'm making a phone call." Arthur Artie Russo arrived in Mercer County at 10 o'clock the next morning. He was a bulldog of a man in a rumpled suit, carrying a battered leather briefcase. He took one look at the diamonds, reviewed Lyora's stamped municipal quitclaim deed for Parcel 402B, and listened to her harrowing story. When she finished, Artie let out a low, predatory whistle. "Calloway made two fatal mistakes," Artie said, pacing Martha's kitchen. "First, he assumed you didn't know the law. Under the legal doctrine of cujus est solum, whoever owns the soil owns everything beneath it, all the way down to the center of the earth. That vault, the whiskey, the gold. It is 100% your legal property, Leora. By locking you in and attempting to extract it, he just committed attempted murder and grand larceny." "And his second mistake?" Leora asked, wrapping her hands around a warm mug. Artie smiled, showing teeth. "He assumed local corruption could stop federal jurisdiction. Calloway's cops might own this county, but Prohibition-era Federal Reserve gold falls under the jurisdiction of the FBI and the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives. We aren't calling the sheriff, we're calling the cavalry." By noon, the rain had finally stopped, leaving a heavy grey fog over Sycamore Lane. Owen Calloway stood on the edge of the sinkhole, a smug smile plastered across his face. He had hired a private, off-the-books extraction crew. An industrial crane was actively winching a massive wooden pallet loaded with crates of pristine 1919 Macallan whiskey and heavy lockboxes of gold bullion out of the earth. "Load it directly into the armored transport," Calloway ordered his foreman, lighting an expensive cigar. "And pour cement down that hole the second the last crate is out." He turned away, mentally calculating the millions he had just secured. But his math was interrupted by the sudden, deafening roar of sirens. From both ends of the industrial road, a fleet of black SUVs and Ohio State Highway patrol cruisers swarmed the block, their tires tearing through the mud. Dozens of heavily armed federal agents and state troopers poured out of the vehicles, weapons drawn, shouting orders to shut down the machinery. Calloway dropped his cigar, his face draining of color. "What the hell is this?" he bellowed, stepping forward. "This is private property. I have the mayor on speed dial." "You can call the president for all I care, Calloway," a booming voice called out. From behind the wall of state troopers walked Artie Russo, and right beside him, wearing a dry, borrowed coat and an expression of pure, unbreakable resolve, was Leora Simmons. Calloway staggered back as if he had seen a ghost. "You? How?" "Hello, Owen," Leora said loudly, her voice ringing out across the muddy lot. "I believe you're trespassing on my property, and you have my whiskey." "Arrest this man," Artie Russo barked, pointing a thick finger at Calloway. "For the attempted murder of my client, unlawful imprisonment, trespassing, and the attempted grand theft of assets, valued well over $10 million. The foreman immediately dropped his radio and put his hands on his head. Two federal agents moved in, slamming Owen Calloway against the muddy hood of his own luxury SUV. The local developer screamed threats, cursing the municipal clerk, the mayor, and Leora, but the metallic click of handcuffs silenced him. Over the next 6 months, the fallout was catastrophic for Calloway and his cronies. To secure a lighter sentence, Calloway turned state's evidence, exposing the corrupt municipal clerk, Brenda Hilliard, who was promptly arrested for altering zoning documents and accepting bribes. Calloway was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison for attempted murder and grand larceny. As for Leora Simmons, the law was absolute. The state upheld her claim to Parcel 402B and everything beneath it. The haul was staggering. The preserved crates of pre-prohibition Macallan single malt sparked a bidding war among global collectors at Sotheby's, netting her a cool $6.4 million. The gold bullion and Art Deco diamonds added another $5 million to her name. From a freezing Honda Civic with $124 to a net worth of over $11 million, Lyora's life transformed overnight. But unlike the people who had tried to crush her, she didn't use her wealth to build walls. Using the leverage of Calloway's arrest, Artie Russo managed to acquire the developer's seized, abandoned textile factory at a fraction of its value. Lyora didn't bulldoze it to build an e-commerce warehouse. She spent $3 million gutting the massive building, reinforcing the walls, and installing state-of-the-art heating, private rooms, a massive commercial kitchen, and an on-site legal clinic. A year later, on a crisp November morning, Lyora stood on the sidewalk of Sycamore Lane. The rusted-out cars and trash were gone. In front of her stood the Pendleton Gable Foundation, the largest, most heavily funded transitionary homeless shelter in the state of Ohio. She walked through the front doors, greeted warmly by the staff and the dozens of people who finally had a warm, safe place to sleep. She walked past the legal wing, where Artie Russo was doing pro bono work, and past the library, where Martha Gable was organizing rows of donated books. Lyora smiled, feeling the warmth of the building chase away the phantom chill of the streets she used to call home. She had found a fortune buried in the dirt, but the real treasure was ensuring no one in her city would ever have to be invisible again. What would you have done if you found a multi-million-dollar treasure buried beneath a forgotten patch of dirt? Lyora's incredible journey proves that sometimes the greatest fortunes are found by those who refuse to give up. If you were captivated by this story of survival, justice, and the ultimate underdog victory, hit that like button, share this story with someone who needs a reminder to keep fighting, and subscribe to the channel for more unbelievable real-life dramas.